Officer Mark Reynolds had been on the police force for more than 10 years. He had seen all kinds of things on the job, good, bad, and strange. But most of his shifts were quiet, especially in the small town where he worked. People knew each other here, and trouble wasn't common. Even so, Mark always stayed alert. He knew that sometimes the most unexpected moments could change everything. That evening, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a deep blue sky. The streetlights had flickered on, casting long shadows on the empty roads. It was the final hour of Mark's shift, and he was looking forward to going home, taking off his boots, and relaxing. But as he drove down one of the quieter streets, something caught his attention. Up ahead, an old sedan was moving unevenly. It wasn't speeding, but it swayed slightly within the lane, as if the driver wasn't fully in control. Mark narrowed his eyes. This could mean many things. Maybe the driver was tired, distracted, or even under the influence of something. Whatever the reason, he had to check. With a practiced motion, he reached for his radio and reported the situation. Then he switched on his patrol car's flashing lights. The red and blue colors reflected off the pavement as the sedan slowed down. A few seconds later, the driver pulled over to the side of the road. Mark took a deep breath, preparing himself for whatever came next. He had done traffic stops countless times, and most of them were routine. But something about this situation made him feel a little uneasy, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just the quietness of the night, or maybe it was the way the car had moved. He stepped out of his patrol car and adjusted his belt. His hand rested lightly on his holster, not out of fear, but out of habit. As he approached the driver's side window, he saw a young woman gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her posture was stiff, and even in the dim light, Mark could tell she was nervous. She rolled down the window slowly, her fingers trembling slightly. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Mark nodded politely. "Good evening, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" The woman swallowed hard before answering. "No, I'm not sure." Mark studied her face for a moment. There was no smell of alcohol, no obvious signs of anything illegal, but her reaction was unusual. Most people looked surprised, annoyed, or even apologetic. But this woman, she looked anxious, almost as if she were hiding something. "License and registration, please," he said, keeping his voice calm. She fumbled in her bag and handed him the documents. He took them and glanced at the name printed on the license, Emily Carter. At that moment, he had no idea that this name, or the woman in front of him, was about to change his life forever. Mark took the license and registration from the young woman and glanced at the name, Emily Carter. The name didn't mean anything to him at first, but there was something about her face, something that felt strangely familiar. He couldn't quite place it, but he pushed the thought aside for now. He shined his flashlight inside the car, quickly scanning the interior. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No open bottles, no suspicious items, nothing that indicated trouble. The car was clean, just a little old. The only thing that stood out was how tense Emily looked. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles turning pale. "Where are you headed tonight?" Mark asked casually, keeping his tone calm and professional. Emily hesitated for a second before answering. "Just going home," she said. Mark nodded. "Where's home?" She licked her lips nervously. "A few towns over. I was visiting a friend." There was nothing unusual about her answer, but something still felt off. Mark had stopped plenty of nervous drivers before, but this wasn't the usual kind of nervousness. It wasn't just worry about getting a ticket. It was something deeper. He could see it in her eyes. He glanced back at her license, checking the address. It matched what she had said, and everything on the registration looked fine. There was no reason to hold her longer, but his instincts told him there was more to this situation than just a routine traffic stop. "Have you been drinking tonight?" he asked, watching her reaction carefully. Emily's eyes widened slightly. "No, I don't drink," she said quickly. Mark believed her. There were no signs of intoxication, no slurred speech, no smell of alcohol. But her reaction confirmed something. She was scared, and not of him giving her a ticket. It was something else. "Mind if I ask why you seemed a little distracted while driving?" Mark continued, hoping she would open up. Emily shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "I just had a lot on my mind," she admitted. Mark studied her face again. There was sadness there, hidden beneath the nervousness. Whatever was going on in her life, it was weighing on her heavily. He thought about letting her go with a warning, but then something caught his eye. A small mark on her wrist. It was only visible for a second when she moved her hand, but it made him pause. A tattoo. A small, delicate design. At first, it just looked like a simple heart, but then he saw something inside it. A name. Mark's breath caught in his throat as his flashlight illuminated the inked letters. Liam. His heart started pounding. The name sent a shock through his body, stirring memories he had buried deep in his mind. He suddenly felt like the world had slowed down. Why did she have that name tattooed on her wrist? Mark felt his chest tighten as he stared at the small tattoo on Emily's wrist. The name Liam was written in delicate, flowing script, surrounded by a tiny heart. It was simple, yet something about it sent a wave of emotions rushing through him. His grip on the flashlight tightened as memories he had buried long ago began to resurface. He hadn't heard that name in years, but he hadn't forgotten it either. He couldn't. Emily noticed the way his eyes were fixed on her tattoo, and she instinctively pulled her hand back, covering her wrist with her sleeve. It was a quick, almost defensive move, as if she was used to hiding it. Her nervousness grew, and her eyes darted toward the rearview mirror, as if considering whether she should drive away. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. His job required him to stay calm and collected, no matter what he faced. But this was different. This was personal. Liam, he said softly, testing the name on his tongue. His voice was almost a whisper, but in the quiet night, it felt loud. Emily's entire body stiffened. Her eyes snapped back to his, filled with something between surprise and fear. "What?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to continue. He knew he had to tread carefully. This wasn't just another traffic stop anymore. This was something else entirely. "That name," he said, pointing slightly at her wrist. "Liam. Who is he?" Emily blinked a few times, looking at him as if trying to decide whether to answer. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled her sleeve down further, fully covering the tattoo. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than before. "He was my little brother," she said. He passed away a long time ago." The words hit Mark like a punch to the stomach. He felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. He had spent years trying to forget that night, trying to push it out of his mind. But standing there, looking at Emily, it all came rushing back. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was pounding. Emily nodded but said nothing. Her fingers gripped the steering wheel tightly again, her knuckles turning pale. Mark could tell this wasn't something she talked about often. Maybe not at all. His mind raced as the memories became clearer. He remembered a cold night, flashing red and blue lights, the sound of sirens, and the cries of a little boy. Liam Carter. A boy he had tried to save but couldn't. Mark swallowed hard, suddenly unsure of what to say next. He had spent years wondering about Liam's family, about the people left behind. And now, here she was, his sister, sitting right in front of him. And she had no idea that he had been there the night Liam died. Mark felt like time had stopped. The quiet night, the flashing lights from his patrol car, and the weight of the badge on his chest all faded into the background. His mind was stuck in the past, in a memory he had tried for years to forget. He could still hear the distant sound of sirens from that night. He remembered rushing into a small house, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of the chaos inside. A little boy, no older than 7 or 8, lay motionless on the floor. His name was Liam Carter. Mark had knelt beside him, speaking softly, telling him to hold on. But there had been too much damage. The ambulance had arrived, but it was too late. Mark had watched helplessly as the paramedics did everything they could, but the boy never made it. And now, all these years later, his sister was sitting right in front of him. Mark forced himself to focus on the present. Emily still looked tense, her fingers gripping the steering wheel like she was afraid to let go. The way she had reacted to his question made it clear that she didn't like talking about the past. "I didn't mean to upset you," Mark said gently. I recognized the name." Emily looked at him with confusion. "You knew Liam?" Mark hesitated. He knew this wasn't the kind of conversation that could happen in a few short minutes during a routine traffic stop. But he also knew he couldn't just let her drive away without telling her the truth. "I was there," he finally said. "The night it happened." Emily's face changed instantly. Her eyes widened, and her breath caught in her throat. She stared at him, trying to process his words. "You mean, you were the officer?" Mark nodded slowly. "I was the first one on the scene. I stayed with him until the paramedics arrived." Emily's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, but no words came out. She looked away, blinking rapidly. Her hands relaxed on the steering wheel, but her body remained tense. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt heavy, filled with unspoken emotions. Finally, Emily let out a shaky breath. "I never knew who it was," she admitted. "I was too young at the time. My parents, they didn't talk about it much. But Liam used to tell me stories about a police officer. He said you were nice to him." Mark felt something tighten in his chest. He had carried the weight of that night for so long, wondering if he could have done more. Hearing that Liam had remembered him, even in his final moments, made his heart ache in a way he couldn't describe. "I tried to save him," Mark said, his voice quiet. "I really did." Emily turned back to face him. There were tears in her eyes, but she managed a small nod. "I believe you," she whispered. Emily sat in silence, staring at the dashboard. The air between them was thick with emotion, and Mark wasn't sure what to say next. He had spent years carrying the memory of that night, the guilt of not being able to save Liam. Now, standing here with Liam's sister, he realized she had been carrying the same weight in her own way. After what felt like an eternity, Emily finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "He used to talk about you." Mark's breath caught in his throat. "What?" Emily turned her gaze toward him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Liam, before everything happened, he used to tell me about a police officer who would visit the neighborhood. He said you were nice. You gave him stickers once." Mark swallowed hard. The memory rushed back to him. Years ago, he had been assigned to a community outreach program in that area. He remembered meeting Liam, a small boy with bright eyes and an endless curiosity about everything. He used to wave excitedly whenever he saw Mark's patrol car. One day, Mark had given him a few police badge stickers, and Liam had acted like they were the greatest treasure in the world. Emily let out a shaky breath. "He said he wanted to be like you when he grew up." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. His hands, which had been resting near his belt, clenched into fists. He had always wondered if Liam had been scared that night, if he had felt alone. But now, knowing that Liam had remembered him in those moments, that he had found comfort in his presence, it was overwhelming. "I never forgot him," Mark admitted. "I think about him all the time. I always wished I could have done more." Emily wiped at her eyes and shook her head. "You were there," she said firmly. "That means something. More than you know." For so long, Mark had blamed himself. He had told himself that if he had gotten there just a few minutes earlier, maybe things would have been different. But hearing Emily's words made him realize something. Sometimes, just being there for someone, even in their last moments, mattered. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It was filled with understanding, a shared grief that connected them in a way neither of them had expected. Emily took a deep breath. I got this tattoo after he passed. I wanted to keep him close, no matter where I went. Mark nodded. He'd be proud of you. Emily smiled softly, though sadness still lingered in her eyes. I think he'd be proud of you, too. For the first time in years, Mark felt something inside him shift. The guilt didn't completely disappear, but for the first time, it wasn't so heavy. The night air felt different now. Not as heavy, not as cold. Mark stood beside Emily's car, still trying to process everything. He had stopped her, expecting just another routine traffic check. But instead, he had come face to face with a past he had never been able to forget. Emily sat quietly in the driver's seat, staring out the windshield. She had spent years grieving for her little brother, carrying the pain of his loss. And now she had met the one person who had been with Liam in his final moments. After a long silence, Emily finally spoke. I used to ask my parents about that night, she said softly. I wanted to know everything, but they didn't like talking about it. It was too painful for them. Mark nodded, understanding completely. Losing someone like that, it's not something you ever really get over. Emily glanced at him. What about you? Did you ever talk about it? Mark let out a slow breath. Not really. It's different when you're an officer. You see a lot of things you wish you could forget. But some moments stay with you forever. That night with Liam, I never stopped thinking about it. Emily's eyes softened. I used to have nightmares about it, she admitted. I was just a kid, but I knew something terrible had happened. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, crying, wishing I could have done something to change it. Mark felt a pang in his chest. He had been through the same thing, waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memories. But he had always kept it to himself, believing no one would understand. Now, for the first time, he realized he wasn't alone. I'm sorry, he said, his voice filled with sincerity, for everything you went through. Emily gave a small, sad smile. Me too, but I'm glad I met you tonight. It's strange, isn't it? Of all the people who could have stopped me, it was you. Mark nodded slowly. It wasn't just strange, it felt like fate. As if, after all these years, life had finally brought them together to find some kind of closure. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The flashing lights of Mark's patrol car cast soft reflections on Emily's windshield, making the night feel even more surreal. Finally, Emily let out a breath and reached for her keys. I should probably get home, she said. Mark hesitated, then gave a small nod. Drive safe. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Then, with a quiet voice, she asked, would it be okay if we talked again sometime? Mark felt a warmth spread through his chest. Yeah, he said. I'd like that. Emily smiled, a real smile this time. Then she started the car, and as she drove away, Mark stood there watching. For the first time in years, he felt lighter. The past hadn't changed, but maybe, just maybe, he had finally found a way to heal. Mark sat in his patrol car for a long time after Emily drove away. The night was quiet, but his mind wasn't. Everything that had happened in the last hour played over and over again in his head. He had spent years trying to forget that night, believing he had failed. But tonight had shown him something he never expected. He hadn't been forgotten. Liam had remembered him. Even as a child, even in his last moments, he had spoken about Mark. And now, his sister had unknowingly brought all those memories back. But this time, they didn't just bring guilt. They'd brought something else. A sense of peace. Mark let out a deep breath and put his car in drive. He continued his patrol, but his heart wasn't as heavy as before. He had been carrying the past like a weight on his shoulders, but now, it didn't feel as unbearable. The next morning, as Mark sat at his desk in the station, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and was surprised to see an unknown number. Emily. Hi, Officer Mark. I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to say thank you for everything. Mark stared at the message for a moment before replying. "Mark, you're not bothering me at all. And you don't have to thank me." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "Emily, I do though. I never got to know what really happened that night, and talking to you helped more than you know." Mark smiled to himself. He had never expected to reconnect with someone from such a painful part of his past. But now that he had, he realized it was something he had needed. "Mark, if you ever want to talk again, I'm here." Emily's response came quickly. "Emily, I'd like that." Mark set his phone down, feeling something he hadn't in a long time: hope. The past would always be a part of him. He couldn't change what had happened, but for the first time, he felt like he didn't have to carry it alone. Liam may have been gone, but his memory lived on. And now, through Emily, Mark had a chance to honor it, not through guilt, but through something far more powerful: understanding. Over the next few weeks, Mark and Emily kept in touch. It started with small messages, just checking in, sharing memories of Liam, and talking about life. But over time, their conversations became something more. They weren't just two people connected by tragedy. They were two people helping each other heal. One evening, Emily invited Mark to a small cafe near her workplace. He hesitated at first, unsure if it was the right thing to do, but something inside him told him to go. When he arrived, Emily was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. She smiled when she saw him. "I wasn't sure if you'd come." Mark took a seat across from her. "Neither was I," he admitted with a small chuckle. Emily stirred her coffee, looking thoughtful. "I've been thinking a lot since that night," she said. "For years, I felt like Liam's story ended the night he passed. But meeting you made me realize something. His story didn't just stop. It kept going, through the people who loved him." Mark nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "I used to think I failed him," he confessed, "that I could have done more. But after talking to you, I see things differently now." Emily smiled softly. "You were there for him when he needed someone the most. That's not failure, Mark. That's kindness." Her words touched him in a way he couldn't explain. He had spent so many years carrying the burden alone, but now it felt lighter. Liam had been more than just a memory. He had been a bright, kind-hearted boy who had left an impact on both of them. And now, they were carrying his memory forward, not with sadness, but with love. They talked for hours that evening, sharing stories, laughing at old memories, and finding comfort in knowing they weren't alone. By the time they left the cafe, the past no longer felt like a painful shadow. It felt like a part of them that had shaped who they were, and that was okay. As they stood outside, Emily looked up at the sky. "I think Liam would have liked this," she said softly. Mark followed her gaze. "Yeah, I think so too." For the first time in years, Mark didn't feel like he was running from the past. Instead, he was walking forward, toward something new, something meaningful. And as he and Emily said their goodbyes, he knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning of something that neither of them had expected, something built on understanding, healing, and the memory of a little boy who had brought them together.